Hello everyone, and welcome to this evening's event from the City of Westminster Archives Centre. This talk commemorates the bicentenary of the Cato Street Conspiracy, which actually falls tomorrow on the 1st of May. And it was on this date, exactly 201 years ago, that William Davidson and a number of his co-conspirators were led to the gallows outside Newgate Prison. You'll hear all about that very soon, but first I would like to introduce you to our speaker for this evening, who's my colleague Peter Daniel. Peter is the Education Officer here at the Archives Centre, and he does amazing work researching the stories contained in our archives and really bringing them alive to a wide audience, particularly for kids. He's always very busy organising workshops for schools and making documentary films about some of the most momentous events in the history of Westminster. He also manages several history websites, including one on the Cato Street Conspiracy, which has recently gone live. And if you have a look in the chat, I've put a link to that there. So congratulations, Peter, on that, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you also to all of you in the audience who've joined us from home. Before I hand you over, just to let you know that this talk will be about an hour and 15 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A, where Peter will be answering your questions. You can type your question in the Q&A at any point during the talk, and we look forward to seeing them. Finally, just to let you know that a recording of this talk will be sent to you by tomorrow, and it will be available to watch for the next 7 days. So if you want to see it all again, folks, that's no problem. Well, that's all from me. In just a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Peter.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. So my opening slide here, you can see a wonderful Cruikshank print from Westminster Archives Ashbridge collection. We're really fortunate that we got a grant of £74,000 from the Heritage Fund to put this project together. It's been kind of delayed a little bit by COVID, but we hope to complete the project this October. And a number of the outputs that we've managed to create so far, and which we'll be working on this summer, you can find on catostreetconspiracy.org.uk. So, 201 years ago, the Cato Street conspirators were executed. They were actually captured on Sunday, the 23rd of February, 1820. So, in short, a quick summary of what it was all about. Following the Napoleonic Wars, there was a huge depression in the country. Napoleon had been defeated, but many of the returning soldiers came back to unemployment, rising prices and poverty. People were frustrated by a reactionary government, the government of Lord Liverpool, that seemed to oppress free speech amongst the people, and a group of Spenceans, people that were almost proto-communists, gathered together and decided, once they'd heard the government ministers were meeting in Grosvenor Square, that the only way they could change Britain was by assassinating the cabinet, chopping off the head of the government in one foul swoop. What they didn't know is that their group had been infiltrated. One of their number, Edwards, was a government spy, and when they were meeting to plan their final raid on that particular evening, the Bow Street runners were waiting for them. Just before 8 o'clock, they burst into the barn. And although Smithers, one of the Bow Street runners, was run through, and some of them escaped, they were eventually rounded up, tried for treason, and 5 of them were executed on the gallows at Newgate. So, whereabouts is Cato Street? So if you look at the map on the left-hand side of the screen from the Ashbridge collection, you can see that Cato Street is an enclosed alleyway. It's very easy to miss it. It's not very far off the Edgware Road and just a stone's throw from Oxford Street. So why was it chosen as the place for the conspirators? Well, it was chosen by one of the conspirators, John Harrison, who'd been a former lifeguard. So you can see on the map to the right-hand side, the Laurie and Whittle map from 1819, the lifeguard barracks at number 2. He wanted someone that was close enough to Grosvenor Square, Lord Harrowby's house where the cabinet were meeting. So he'd gone along and hired a former stable that had been around from about 1803 that belonged to a retired general called General Watson. Now, Marylebone at that time is very, very different. It's a semi-rural area. So, before the conspirators were used there, it's probably mainly used for cows. So that's the other image. On the left-hand side, you can see what it would have looked like at the time. And the amazing thing about the Cato Street Conspiracy is that the barn still remains, the building still remains. You can see the pictures on the right-hand side of the screen, the commemorations we did last year, just before the first lockdown. We celebrated and marked the uncovering of the plot on the 23rd of February 1820. So what the conspirators were trying to do to remove the government, the heads of the government and the cabinet all in one swoop, was really what Guy Fawkes tried to do in 1605. Now, whereas Guy Fawkes, everybody's heard of them, and the Gunpowder Plot is commemorated every year on the 5th of November, the Cato Street Conspirators are largely forgotten. Now, in British history, there have been other occasions when people have plotted to remove the cabinet and the government, remove the Prime Minister, most recent being at Brighton with the Grand Hotel, when the IRA attempted to assassinate Mrs. Thatcher and her cabinet in 1984. Each time this has been tried, from Guy Fawkes to the Cato Street Conspirators to the IRA, they have found. It's never been, it's only Spencer Perceval, who was killed by a lone gunman, John Bellingham, the only time a head of state has been removed through assassination. So who were the cabinet? So Lord Liverpool's government, probably the most famous member of the cabinet that most people recognise would be the Duke of Wellington. 5 years after the the Battle of Waterloo, his star was in the ascendant. Some other interesting members of the cabinet, Lord Harrowby, well, that's the house in Grosvenor Square where they were meeting, 39 Grosvenor Square. But the two that were most hated throughout the country were Castlereagh and Sidmouth. Percy Bysshe Shelley condemned both of them. Sidmouth, the Home Secretary, who cracked down on so many civil liberties, was compared to a crocodile. And Castlereagh, well, there's a famous line about him: "I met murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh." These people were hated. They were all rich property owners who really managed the government of this country in their own interests and not really in the interests of the people. So this is where Lord Harrowby lived, a closed-off garden square in Marylebone. This is Grosvenor Square. Lots of you will be familiar with it because at Christmas time you may have tuned in on Netflix to Bridgerton and seen the same square depicted there, where you had the bon ton, the great and the good meeting to choose partners for their sons and daughters, the aristocracy. Now that closed-off square, that opulence, that extravagant wealth was in the heart of a city that was torn apart by the poverty that had been created by the Napoleonic Wars and the frictions of the Industrial Revolution. Now, at Westminster Archives, you can see how worried the aristocracy was to be in a city where such poverty existed. If you look at the map, you can see when they built Grosvenor Square, they were building it like a guarded community. You can see they had guard stables. You can see they even had their own water supply. They were ready for a siege. They were ready for a revolution. Now, unfortunately, 39 Grosvenor Square no longer exists, but there are plans on the British Architectural Survey, and there are photographs of the interior of 39 Grosvenor Square from about the 1870s. And at Westminster Archives, we gave them to a very talented chap called Rob, who used them and worked with a number of volunteers to recreate what it would have looked like inside Lord Harrowby's house, the place where the Cato Street Conspirators had planned to attack. So you can see some still images here, but I'm delighted I'll be able to show you a quick 1-minute film to show you the interior of this opulent mansion. Be interesting to compare this later on to the Cato Street barn. It's a real comparison between how the rich and the poor lived. So we walk through the gates of this gated community in Grosvenor Square into the entrance hall. The conspirators plan to bluff their way in. Their blunderbusses, their pistols, and their homemade hand grenades. Any of the servants that got in their way would have been dispatched ruthlessly. Eventually, they would have found themselves from the reception rooms, the grand staircase that led upstairs to the dining room where Lord Liverpool's cabinet were allegedly meeting on the night of the 23rd of February, 1820. Thistlewood, Run, Davidson, Ings, desperate group of Cato Street conspirators would have run up this group of stairs, plunged into the grand dining room. And Ings in particular wanted to find Castlereagh and Seaton. Ings was a butcher, a failed Portsmouth butcher who'd lost his business, was desperate, and he hated these two individuals more than any other. He planned to behead them and parade their heads in the streets of London to declare this was the beginning of a Spencean revolution. So what was the plan after, if this had happened, if they'd killed the cabinet? Well, you can see on the map here, the first thing was to go to points 1 and 2. That's Gray's Inn Road and the artillery ground of Finsbury Circus. Capture the cannons there to try and take on then the Bank of England, to destroy all the hated paper money, the debt that was incurred by the Napoleonic Wars, go to the Tower of London, recruit soldiers and get more armaments, and then set up a provisional government at the Mansion House. And they imagined today that the Prime Minister that they wanted to appoint was the MP for Westminster, John Cam Hobhouse. So when we done this project, we wanted to tell it as a story to the children to put them across. So we told it through the eyes of the Jamaican conspirator, William Davidson. So let's tell you a little bit more about his story. From the Cruikshank print, you can see him. Cruikshank got him slightly wrong here. He was a very handsome chap, and he certainly had a lot more hair than you can see in that picture. And this is the dramatic moment when Thistlewood runs Smithers through, when the Bow Street runners burst into the Cato Street barn. But where was Davidson from? Well, I said he was from Jamaica. Born in 1786, just before the French Revolution, to a Scottish father, slave owner, and a free black mother. Now, his mother's family must have been arrived in Jamaica through the triangular trade. So even though William Davidson was free and his mother was free, he would have known all about slavery. Oops, I'm just going to go back and just do thing. As part of our project, we were planning to take an actor into schools to talk to children and to tell the story of William Davidson, but because of COVID, that couldn't go ahead. So instead, we filmed the actor describing the last moments of William Davidson, telling his life story in Newgate Prison. I just want to play you the opening part of the film because it's a great speech which Davidson gave during his imprisonment, which really kind of gave his motivation to be involved in the Cato Street Conspiracy.
If I had 50 lives, I would sacrifice them all for the welfare of the suffering poor of England. I have fought and suffered with the very people whose hard lot I have striven constantly to alleviate. Here I lie, many miles from the place I was born. It is impossible to describe the terror in my mind when the cell door closed firmly shut and left me to my thoughts. My dismal Newgate cell is an emblem of hell itself, and some may say be the entrance to it. Tomorrow the sun will rise for me for the very last time. Before then, I must tell you my story.
So Davidson had been born into Jamaica, a place completely built around the slave economy, built on the white gold of sugar. And the criminal enslavement of so many people in a brutal industry must have had an impact on him, must have been one of his motivations to stand up for those who were oppressed within society. Now, when we were trying to put this together for children to try and explain his story, one of the interesting links that we found when we explored his story, that when William Davidson moved to London and lived in Marylebone, he lived alongside Lord's cricket ground. So I wanted to try and get the artists we were working on the project to draw a parallel. So I wanted to see whether, when he was born, whether he would have seen cricket being played in Jamaica. I'll show you a little bit of some of the research I did on that later on, but you can see in this picture here, the rich landowner and plantation owners would play cricket and deposit their slaves around the boundary to throw the ball in. Some of these slaves would often actually take part in some of the games. And in the moments when they played, when they bowled at some of the plantation owners, they found freedom. You can see that quote on the right-hand side there from Clem Sitcharan, who's a West Indian historian. They found freedom through the sport. Now, I'll just go back to that slide, you can see the hills in the distance behind here. In Jamaica, those hills were the home of the Maroons, the slaves that had escaped and sought freedom and who had fought back against their oppressors. Once again, it made me wonder whether this was something, as an early tender years of William Davidson's life, growing up in the years following the French Revolution, that he may have been inspired by these black revolutionists that were fighting back against the people that had enslaved them. And to research that picture, I had to prove really whether cricket was being played at that time. Found some fascinating links. This buckle here, it's the only known image of a slave playing cricket. It's a mixed race slave playing in Barbados. How do we know it? The buckle was found on the River Tweed in the 1970s. And it was believed to belong to a man called William Hotham, who was an admiral in the Caribbean fleet. And with a weird kind of connection to Westminster, he's one of the people that was involved in the establishment of the Lord's cricket ground. But the weirdest connection, and it's kind of almost freaked me out a little bit when I found it, I wanted to prove to prove to the artist that when we were drawing, having these pictures made up, that it was a legitimate thing to show the young William Davidson watching a cricket match. We looked for the evidence that cricket was played at that time. And the very first evidence we came across was from a manuscript in the university at Yale. And there was a quotation from a plantation owner that said, "In the evening, Mr. Beckford went to play cricket." It came from a diary that belonged to a man called Thomas Thistlewood. Now, as soon as I saw that name, Thistlewood, my kind of like heart almost stopped. How many Thistlewoods were there? And then I looked at where he was supposed to be from, and he was from Lincolnshire. And he was related to Arthur Thistlewood, the leader of the Cato Street Conspiracy. And what a contrast. Thomas Thistlewood, the slave owner, Arthur Thistlewood, the leader of the Cato Street Conspiracy, a leading Spencean who abhorred slavery. Two men in the same family, two completely conflicting outlooks. So we kind of brought that into the project. So at the age of 15, William Davidson was sent to England to study the law. His mother apparently was incredibly upset. And there was a feeling in the Caribbean that England was a place of freedom. And that had been reinforced by a judgment by William Cooper, a judge in 1772, that the idea that anyone who stepped forth in England and breathed English air was free. You couldn't have slavery here. But William first came to Glasgow, and he moved to Liverpool. It was an interesting time when he was at Liverpool. I'll just go back to that previous slide. When he was studying the law there, it was the time when the Slave Trade Act was going through and banning the trade. Kitty's Amelia, the last slave ship, left Liverpool in 1807. So he must have followed this debate very keenly. But even though he was fascinated by the law, it wasn't enough for him. He was kind of a man of action. He was always looking for excitement in his life. And he ran away to sea, as so many people who living around Liverpool, close to the sea and the port there, did. He actually went as a clerk on a ship. And whilst at sea, the ship was stopped by a Royal Naval ship, and William was press ganged. Here's the ultimate irony. A man who was born free in Jamaica, who was never a slave, was enslaved by the Royal Navy. And to some extent, the Navy had no choice. Fighting a war against the French, The Navy went from the beginning, before the Napoleonic Wars, a Navy of 10,000 men, went by 1812 to 140,000 sailors. Almost all of them had been impressed. William eventually came back home. He fell in love and was disappointed in love and ran away to sea again and was press ganged again for a second time. So this was really at the heart of the Napoleonic Wars. There's no precise dates, but quite possibly at the time of Trafalgar. This image from the Royal Museum, Greenwich, shows you how many West Indian black sailors were in the Royal Navy. And it's something we should know in Westminster, because as you pass up into Trafalgar Square, have a look at Nelson's column, and you see the death of Nelson, the hero, at the top of that column. There's an African sailor, a sniper, holding his rifle as Nelson dies on the deck. Now, William deserted. So the second time up this thing, he became so fed up with the Navy, he deserted. So he obviously couldn't stay in and around the port of Liverpool anymore. So he moved to the Midlands, to Staffordshire. And his parents sent him a lot of money to set himself up as a cabinet maker. He was very talented at it. And here's another weird kind of coincidence in the story, is that he was commissioned by Lord Harrowby to go to his mansion at Sandon Hall to create some cabinets for his new home. Now, this is the same Lord Harrowby who would own the house in Grosvenor Square that in 1820 William would go to attack on that night, the 23rd of February. Now, whilst he was here, he did very well for himself. His business thrived, and his parents actually sent him quite a considerable amount of money. You can see £11,200 to set up and to live like a gentleman. You can see that print to the left-hand side. He was a very dapper individual, a very handsome individual. And watching Bridgerton, drawn to it over Christmas because it was set in Grosvenor Square at the same time as the Cato Street Conspiracy, I was drawn by the similarities between Reggie Jean-Paul, the kind of like hero, Lord Hastings, and his relationship in that particular series, and the idea of William Davidson and his unfortunate relationship with Miss Salt. He fell in love with a young lady, but his Mr. Salt was going to have nothing to do with William Davidson. William and young Miss Salt met in secret, and when Mr. Salt found out, he went after William with his pistol. Fired a shot. William was lucky. The pistol shot just went through his hat. But it was William who was arrested, not Mr. Salt. He was thrown into prison, but luckily for him, you can see in the picture we got our artist Kate Moulton to put this in, there was a witness that had seen what had happened. And so quickly, it was Mr. Salt that was in prison rather than William Davidson. And he would only be released if William would drop charges, which he agreed to do as long as the father would agree that he could marry his daughter. The father did agree, but only when she was 21. And William waited, and whilst they were apart, Miss Salt fell for another man, and William was feeling suicidal. He just had to get away from Staffordshire, and this was what brought him to London. So he came to London, lived in Woolworths in South London, set up again as a cabinet maker, and he met a widower called Sarah Lane. And once again in Bridgerton, you have the wedding in Bridgerton here. William Davidson's wedding was in St. Martin's in the Fields. And shortly afterwards, his two sons were born, John in 1816 and Duncan in 1819. And the young family set up home next to the second Lord's Cricket Ground, not very far from Lisson Grove, and lived quite happily there. And that's what gave us that image here that you can see of William taking his sons for a walk and seeing the fledgling game of cricket coming alive at Lord's Cricket Ground. Now, cricket's quite an interesting thing. It was the game of the upper classes, the aristocracy, and mainly was a feature of something they could use as a mean to gamble and to bet. If you look at the poster on the top right-hand side, you can see large bets were placed, which based around the guinea coin. 1,000 guineas was the prize for the winners of this cricket match. Well, the guinea coin, if you look at that guinea coin I've got on the side here from James II, You can see the elephant and castle symbol, the symbol of the Royal African Company. The guinea coin was totally involved with the slave trade. There's an ironic connection there. The other thing I wanted the artist to put into this picture here was how the riffraff were kept out of Lords. They put the admission just enough to keep them out. But the fence is there, the way of keeping apart the rich and the poor, the enclosure of land, was one of the big features that drove the Cato Street Conspiracy, because enclosure was a big deal at this particular time. Now, from medieval times, the poor had always relied on the common pasture to survive. And then, as you can see on the graph at the top, from Tudor times, building up to the 18th century, when it kind of reached its peak, enclosure allowed the rich to steal the land from the people. And what this did was drive the poor from the countryside into the cities in search of work. They could no longer survive in the countryside without the common land. So the major cities of England grew massively. Even though they grew massively, cities like Manchester and Birmingham just didn't have any democratic representation. Manchester didn't have an MP. It was ridiculous, but it was also outrageous how the common land had been stolen by basically the aristocracy, who used Parliament, which they completely controlled, to manipulate the law to give them what they wanted. A poem from that period has been beautifully put to music. I just want to play it to you and just listen to the words. And the final verse really sets the idea up that if you really want something done about it, you have to get off your backside and probably get involved in revolution. It's called Goose and Common. Davidson and the Cato Street conspirators wanted to steal the common back. And when William moved to London, he started mixing with the Spenceans, this group of proto-communists who wanted to share the land and have democracy where everybody was involved in the governing of the country. And he soon met a man called John Harrison. John Harrison, the man I told you who actually hired the Cato Street barn, he was a former lifeguard, and he'd fought in the Peninsular War, but he had also policed the streets of London. Before the Metropolitan Police, the lifeguards were London's police. You can see him here in Grosvenor Square. Kate Morton recreated him on patrol. And for a common man that came from a very humble background, to see the oppression of the poor and to actually be protecting people that were stealing from these poor people, stealing the land, stealing the common land from them, it drove him to become a revolutionary. Now, many of the Cato Street conspirators you can see, Davidson, Thistlewood, Tidd, Brunt, Harrison, Adams, Ings, had all been involved in one way or another in the Napoleonic Wars. And during those wars, Napoleon had brought in his continental system. And what that had done is blocked the export of wheat to the United Kingdom. And that was great for the landowners, because what that meant is they had a monopoly over the supply, and they could rise the price of wheat to whatever they want. And they made great fortunes. You can see the Cruikshank cartoon on the right-hand side, Prince Regent and the aristocracy just coining it in because of what Napoleon had done with his continental system. So when the war ended, that should have come to an end. The free supply of wheat from the continent should have driven the price of bread down, but it didn't, because the Corn Laws were brought in, which kept the price of wheat artificially high. And it was something John Harrison was vividly aware of, because he was a baker. When he left the army following the Peninsular Wars, he came into London and he was a baker, and his bread was priced beyond the pockets of the poor. Now, he must have spoken to William Davidson about the idle extravagance of the Prince Regent. So in 1811, the Prince Regent had a party to celebrate becoming the Prince Regent. His father, George III, stark raving mad. But he had this huge party, Carlton House, and Kate Morton did this wonderful picture here to show you the appalling, it's almost difficult to put into words what you see here, but the Prince Regent had live goldfish flowing down the table, plates made of solid gold, and so much food that went to waste at the end that John Harrison and his friends were left with, well, effectively doggy bags to take it home with them. And when he went out into the streets of London, he would have seen people begging for a crust of bread because they couldn't afford to pay for bread because of the Corn Laws that these people had implemented. It must have driven him into desperation, thinking things that must change. And see, behind the Spencers, behind the group of the Cato Street conspirators, were the great thinkers of that time. Thomas Paine, a man who influenced the French Revolution of 1789, but also the American Wars of Independence, wrote about common sense and the rights of man. And if you can see in the cartoon here, you can see the people that he blamed for the oppression of the people in the country. You can see that it's royalty, aristocracy, and the church. And he wanted a world turned upside down, where the majority had the power, not the few. And this world turned upside down reflected thoughts that had come from the Civil War, the time of Cromwell, where that had been promised, but it had never arrived. And the Spenceans wanted to bring this about. But Thomas Spence was the Geordie who came down. This was the days before the internet and television, newspapers, and putting a message out, a political message, was particularly difficult. So Spence found a really intriguing way of putting this out. And as part of this project, I managed to get hold of some of his Conda tokens to show children the messages that he tried to get out. Spence was a member of the London Corresponding Society that was trying to look around for the reform of Parliament. Some very interesting people involved in that, including Alana Equiano, and they were completely against slavery and wanted the complete abolition of that. And you can see at 5, the Conda token there with the pig on. Burke had talked about a swinish multitude, that basically the poor couldn't govern the country because they were too ignorant to do that. But the Spencers, the London Correspondence Society, believed that you had to have faith in democracy, that people would prove to be good governors of their country if it was given to the majority. And what they looked back to is into an English past which they felt pride in. They felt pride in Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights. And why did they feel that pride? Magna Carta, a thing that's revered across the world, the idea that nobody is above the law, not the king, not the Prince Regent, not Lord Liverpool. And the Bill of Rights, which came from the Glorious Revolution, that reinforced the idea that no one, habeas corpus, no one can go to prison without a trial. You couldn't imprison people. You don't want to live in a police state. They were proud of this English birthright that seems to have been taken away from them by Lord Liverpool's government. So a whole range of events built up to the Cato Street Conspiracy in 1820. In 1803, Thistlewood and Tidd were actually involved in the Despard plot. Despard had been a colonel in the army and had fought in the Caribbean. He'd actually met and married a black woman, a freed slave. And when he brought him back to London, he was appalled by the way she was treated and the society he saw in London, and he plotted revolution. He planned to do similar to almost the same plan of seizing arms from the Tower of London and capturing the Bank of England. It seemed to be most of the plots at the time planned to do the same thing. He was caught, found guilty of treason, and had the medieval torture of being hung, drawn, and quartered. Thistlewood and Tidd managed to escape and were never proven to be involved. Then there's the Spa Fields riots. This was a plot by the Spenceans themselves. They gathered at Spa Fields. And Spa Fields is a very historic place, a big meeting that they hoped would gather enough people that maybe could cause a spark that would lead a revolution. They invited the famous speaker, Henry Hunt, who would later speak at Peterloo. Now, where they gathered at Spa Fields, Clerkenwell Fields, it's a place of rich history. This is where Wat Tyler and the peasants from the Peasants of Revolt of 1381 had gathered with their demands for Richard II. The idea that John Ball had brought about when Adam delved and Eve span, who then were the gentlemen? Were people born aristocrats? No. This was something that we had created, and there should be a society where everyone had a say. And Wat Tyler was well ahead of his time, but just like Despard, these men who had rebelled then were hung, drawn, and quartered. Now, the Spa Fields riots had captured armaments, and the rioters had approached the Tower of London. So this was Thistlewood. They thought this was the moment of revolution, but they could not persuade the soldiers there to join their revolution. They were quickly captured. And the reason they were quickly captured is that the plot had been infiltrated by a spy called John Castle, a paid informer, paid by Lord Sidmouth. And at the Old Bailey, Castle was wheeled out to provide his evidence. But as he spoke, he proved to be so dishonest. And the way he was talking and the things he was talking about, he was more of, rather than a witness, he was more of an agent provocateur. He tried to frame the men on trial. And the great thing is that thing that that freedom from Britain, the idea of trial by jury, the jury had not been nobbled, it hadn't been manipulated, and they threw out the case against Watson and Thistlewood and Preston and Hooper, and they were freed to great delight by the crowds who gathered outside the court. The government realised they'd never be able to put their paid spies into the courtroom because they would be discredited, because everyone would see through their ideas. Then, in 1817, the government suspended habeas corpus. They began to imprison people without trial. And this is the time of the Industrial Revolution. It's the time of the Luddites and people rebelling and people being thrown into prison with no trial. And so in the north of England, people decided that they had to come to London to protest. They gathered blankets because they planned to walk here, but they were never allowed to come to London because the government had them arrested and thrown into prison. This was a criminal reactionary government. This was Lord Liverpool's government. Then there's the Pentrick Rising, which was once again infiltrated by spies, and once again, the leaders of that revolt were hung, drawn, and quartered. Now, how were the government able to do this? How were they able to have so much power? It's because only landowners had a say in how the country was run. A fraction of the population. Every election could be bought, as you can see from the cartoon here. And every action, the hustings, the candidates would stand on a platform, and there was no secret votes. People raised their hands to vote for whoever was going to be their member of parliament. So they could bribe them, but they could also intimidate them. You could bring in a local prize fighter and threaten to beat people up unless they voted for you. The system was totally corrupt. The people who had power and made the laws, there was no respect for them whatsoever. And it's because of this, because of a corrupt system that allowed Manchester not to have an MP, that in August 1819, the people of Manchester, women and children, gathered in the square, St. Peter's Square, in the centre of the town, to ask for something that they should have had already. Can we have an MP? Can we be represented? They wanted democracy. And it's very interesting. You can see in this image here from the British Library, they wanted the vote for everyone, including women. They're well ahead of their time. You see Mary Files here campaigning, Henry Hunt. And the people in the crowd carried the French cap of liberty, the idea of revolution. And this scared the burgesses of Manchester. So they sent in the cavalry, who cut down 9 to 15 people were killed, hundreds were injured. And it outraged the people of this country, and it would outrage the Cato Street conspirators. Now, this frightened Lord Liverpool's government, this huge mass meeting. So mass meetings were banned. And the acts of sedition put through cut down the freedom of the press. And the press itself, they made sure that the poor could not read the news by putting a stamp on every newspaper that put any newspaper beyond the pockets of the ordinary man. So the Cato Street conspirators, who were just ordinary tradesmen, they did their best to get round this. They met in Marylebone, Thomas Hazard's reading room, just off of the Edgware Road. Just mainly poor individuals that had an interest in politics that would gather together, pay a small conscription so they could share newspapers. And it was here they heard about what had happened in Manchester. You can see in this image here, you can see William Davidson shaking the hand of Arthur Thistlewood. And behind him, you see Robert Wedderburn, who was also a Jamaican and was also someone who had served in the Royal Navy. He was a revolutionary, but did not take part in the Cato Street conspiracy because he was in prison for sedition when it took place and saved his life. So here are the key conspirators: Davidson, Brunt, Thistlewood, Ings, and Tidd. You can see that many of them were skilled men, cabinet makers, cordwainers, which is a skilled bootmaker. The Industrial Revolution was driving these people out of work. The government had even started to dismantle the apprenticeship system, which had always protected skilled men. They wanted to drive prices down in war to deal with the huge government debt. So these men were at this time thrown into unemployment. Some of them hadn't worked for weeks. They were desperate. They were hungry. So they met at Thomas Hazard's reading room, and they learned about what was going on, and they came together with their plot. They mixed with politicians. It's interesting at this time, John Cam-Homhouse, the MP for Westminster. Westminster was always a bit different. Now, you had the famous Old Sarum in Wiltshire, where the MP, there was 2 MPs for about 1,000 sheep and about 10 people. Westminster was a place that wasn't full of farmers. It was full of small businessmen. So it was always very liberal and returned a liberal MP, radical MPs. And that's what John Cam-Homhouse was. And in 1819, December, there was hustings at Covent Garden. And we believe that William Davidson attended these hustings. And some reports said that he carried a banner, "Let us die like men and not be sold as slaves." If we want liberty, if we want democracy, we'll have to be prepared to die for this. So the men met in the pubs of Soho and Covent Garden. This is an image we had Kate draw of the White Lion in Covent Garden. And they began their plot when one day George Edwards came in and threw a newspaper onto the table and said, the cabinet will be meeting at Lord Harrowby's house. We can take out the whole government, all meeting in one evening. What they didn't know is that George Edwards was a spy, and more than a spy, an agent provocateur paid by Lord Sidmouth. Because what Lord Sidmouth and the Lord Liverpool's government wanted was plenty of examples of people being hung, drawn and quartered. He wanted to make sure that people were scared to contradict the government, to contest the government. They would be too frightened to do so. So they needed the show trials, the huge public executions. Now, Davidson, who'd worked for Lord Harrowby, was sent to Grosvenor Square to check out with some of his friends who were servants there that he'd known in his time working with Lord Harrowby's house at Sandon Hall, to see about this dinner. And when he came and spoke to one of the servants, he was shocked to hear they knew nothing about it. Now, that should have warned the men off. But by this time, the men were desperate. They really wanted to act. Some of them were literally, honestly starving. They needed to act quickly. So they didn't listen to Davidson's warning that there was no knowledge of this particular dinner. So we get to the night, the fateful night, Sunday the 23rd of February, 1820. The conspirators gathered in the barn in Cato Street. It was a cold, wintry night. The snow fell on road, roof and railing. And William Davidson, a powerful figure, was asked to stand guard outside. Now, there was no electric lamps then, it was pitch black. He went into one of the neighbouring houses where Elizabeth Weston gave him a light to light his candle. And it's almost like a metaphor, a light in the darkness, hope that something could change at this particular moment in time. Now, because we have very good pictures and drawings of what Cato Street was like at this time, we gave them to Rob. I showed you the images of Grosvenor Square earlier on, and he created a recreation of what the Cato Street barn was like on that particular night. So that's what I want to show you now. So the snow was falling heavy. One of the worst winters for a long time. Why were the winters so harsh? In 1815, there'd been an eruption in Tambora, a huge volcanic eruption which had thrown so much soot and ash into the atmosphere that harvests for many years had failed. Famously, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in the August of, I think, 1816, when she was in Switzerland, because it's snowing in Switzerland at that time, in August, because this terrible weather that had been created by that eruption. And people think it contributed to revolution through Europe, because the crops failed in so many places. The prices of bread went so high that it really oppressed the poor. Now, in that barn which you've just seen, the plotters gathered together. It's really a homemade plot. Now, this could be almost off a baker. Look at this. It's a recipe for hand grenades. You use suet in a hand grenade. It's incredible. This is not a plot with a lot of money behind it. Now, what these men didn't know is that their every move was being watched by the Bow Street runners. George Ruthven was across the road. He was waiting to pounce. The men were ready to march on Grosvenor Square at 8 o'clock, but before they could do it, Ruthven and his accomplice Smithers from Bow Street runners run up those stairs that you've just seen. And Smithers launched in with a cutlass and charged towards Arthur Thistlewood. Now, Thistlewood, who had served an officer apparently in the militia, the British Army, but also in the French Revolutionary Army, was a skilled swordsman. He drew his sword and ran Smithers through. Then the lights went out, and it was every man for himself. Some gathered and managed to escape through the windows. William Davidson ran down the stairs and tried to escape. Apparently, he pushed his way past the leader of the Coldstream Guards. Captain Fitzclarence was the bastard son of William IV. He talked about a man swinging a sword at him. William was brought down into the snow, and as he was dragged off to the horse and groom, he sang a Scottish revolutionary song, Scots Wahai. And this spoke, you can see the words and the lines above you. It was a poem by Burns. Burns greatly inspired William Davidson because of his Scottish ancestry. And Davidson sang this revolutionary song as he was dragged off to what he knew must be a terrible death, the death of being hung, drawn, and quartered. He'd been captured by the Coldstream Guards that had been based at Portman Barracks. And you can see there's guardsmen there. All three of them that night, 5 years before, had been at Waterloo. And all three of them had been involved in the famous incident when the French guards had tried to break into Huguemont, and they'd managed to push the doors back. These were very, very brave men, but they'd been manipulated by Lord Liverpool's government. Now, Lord Liverpool's government at Sidmouth obviously knew exactly what was supposed to happen. They already had their press releases ready. They knew exactly where the conspirators who had escaped that night, which included Thistlewood, they knew exactly where their bolt holes were because Edwards had told them. So Thistlewood was captured in White Cross Street in Moorfields. He made no resistance, and the people were dragged off to prison. They were separated off. Some went to Tothill Prison, the Bridewell Centre of Westminster. Others to Coldbath Fields, the prison that was called the Bastille, nicknamed the Bastille by the people of London. It was where the post office is in Mount Pleasant today. But the key conspirators were taken to the Tower of London. So you can see the charge sheet here for all those conspirators. I find it interesting, Thomas Hassett, who'd owned the reading rooms in Marylebone, he was accused of misprisioning of high treason. I had to look that up, and what it meant is that he knew about treason and hadn't reported it. He managed to argue his case, and Thomas Preston, who had been involved in the Sparfield riots as well, also argued the case, and their charges against them were dropped. But those key conspirators who were taken to the Tower of London included William Davidson. And they were following in the footsteps of Guy Fawkes, who had also tried to remove the government with his plot and had also found himself imprisoned before his execution in the Tower of London. William was in a cell above Traitor's Gate. And whilst in prison there, you can see this wonderful poem by Thomas Brum. The men were not allowed to use knives and forks because the government was terrified that some of them may commit suicide. They wanted a public execution. They wanted a public example that would scare the living daylights out of the people of this country so no one would contest or challenge them and put off that idea of revolution. So the trial was in April at the Old Bailey. And at that trial, James Ings condemned Edwards because Edwards wasn't brought forward as a witness. The government had learned its lesson that a jury would never convict if they believed that the victims had been put up by the government, been set up by the government. And Thistlewood himself explained the reasons why they had gone to the desperate measures that they had plotted. He said this was all to do with Peterloo, that we had resolved as a group that the lives of the instigators of what happened at Peterloo should be a requiem to the souls of the murdered innocents. William Davidson was called to the bar, and you can see he's referred to as the man of colour. And in his opening speeches, he doubted whether he would get justice because of the colour of his skin. But what's more amazing about his time at the Old Bailey was how William Davidson used his knowledge of the law that he'd learned as a teenager in Liverpool, Glasgow, and in Scotland. And it was the idea that Magna Carta was important to this country, the idea that nobody was above the law, And if people put them above the law and people mistreated the people, then everyone had a right to rise up against them. Now, despite the strong arguments that Thistlewood, Davidson put up, that it wasn't them that had committed treason, but rather Lord Liverpool's government, treason against the people, this was a show trial. And all of the 5 that you can see were accused of treason, were found guilty. There were 11 men that were put on trial. 5 were guilty. 5 pleaded guilty to the crimes and were transported. 1 would be let off. And the judge at the end of the trial read out the terrible words that must have put fear through all of those men, that they would be taken to the place from whence they came and drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, where they would be hanged by their neck until they were dead. And then their heads would be removed from their bodies divided into 4 quarters and disposed of at the wishes of His Majesty. The one person of the 11 that were accused who escaped was James Gilchrist. A really sad story. An ex-soldier who, because he was starving, had been told that there was a loaf of bread and cheese and a pint of beer available in the barn in Cato Street on that night, and had turned up looking for a meal and had been captured and faced a terrible execution. He cried in the Old Bailey and people believed him and he was released. So here is a summary of what happened. Thistlewood, Davidson, Brunt, Tidd and Ings would be executed. 5 men would be transported and only Gilchrist was released and cleared. So in the last days the men had in Newgate, they wrote to their loved ones and their dear ones. You can see sadly the words of Richard Tidd at the bottom. He could barely read or write. I have a very bad hand at writing. Davidson spoke about his feelings of being oppressed as a stranger. Now, Ings and many of the other men had family. They knew that this family would be cast into poverty because of what was going to happen to them now. And they felt a guilt. They didn't feel guilty about what they had planned to do with Lord Liverpool. They felt a guilt that they'd left their families, their children, in danger. Of all the men, many of them were atheists, only Davidson turned to religion. Dr. Cotton was the ordinary of Newgate, and he convinced Davidson to come and pray with him in the days before the execution. And there was a strange thing at Newgate where on the Sunday before an execution, those who were going to be executed would be forced to attend the chapel and would sit, you can look, I've ringed on the site here, sit and look at the coffin that they would eventually be buried in. It's a kind of a last public humiliation. And these are images of the Reverend Cotton, who kept a diary from his time here. There's an illegal diary here. These are images from Peter Harrington's bookshop. This book was sold to showing the images that shows that the entry for the Cato Street conspirators. So the execution was set for the 1st of May 1820. So tomorrow will be the 201st anniversary of the execution of the Cato Street conspirators. So a gallows was set up outside Newgate, and a huge crowd gathered. No one knows how many. Some people say 120, 150,000 people. People died in the crush. The government was terrified that this execution, this public execution they'd set up, may even instigate revolution, because many people there supported the Cato Street conspirators. So they had the lifeguards there, they had the foot guards there to try and keep order. Now, when the men came down onto the platform, one by one they were led down. When Richard Tidd came down, he tripped on the stairs and staggered across the platform. And it was almost like a little dance. And as he did it, he kind of turned and twirled on the platform. And the 100,000 people there roared, and Richard Tidd took a bow. This was his 15 minutes of fame. When James Ings saw this, he thought, well, if I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out in a similar way. He danced down the stairs himself, looking for the cheers of the crowd. But the lifeguards had pushed the crowd back, and his little performance fell on deaf ears. On the platform was Jack Ketch. Jack Ketch was the generic name given to all the executioners. At Westminster Archives, we have a fabulous picture called the Westminster Pit from around this period. Jack Ketch, the Newgate executioner, would attend dog fighting and cockfighting. And you can see he said, yes, I like to see people go about their business the same as I do. A bloodthirsty character that nobody knew exactly who he was. The men then had a chance to say their last words. Thistlewood had no regrets at all for what he had done, and hoped that posterity would see that they had died for liberty, that they were not evil or cruel men. Ings sang on the gallows, "Give me death or liberty." Now, where did that came from? It came from a play called Cato, a tragedy that had been written in 1713. And here's the ultimate irony of the story of the Cato Street Conspirators, that at random they'd picked a barn in a place called Cato Street, a street named after a Roman Republican who had stood up for Caesar, who had stood up for democracy. This is exactly what those men did in 1820. And in this play from 1713, there was a song that had the chorus line, "Give me liberty or give me death." And this is what the butcher James Ings sang in the gallows in his final moments. In the National Library of Scotland, you can see there the words of the song that he sang. I'm not going to try and sing it. I'm sure you wouldn't want me to do that. And so the noose was placed around the men's neck. And William Davidson's last words were that he prayed for the prosperity of the king, but not his ministers. So you can see he had no regrets about what he had done. He only felt regrets that he was leaving his two young sons behind and Sarah Lane in their small house next to Lord's cricket ground. So there they are on the gallows in the last moment, William Davidson kneeling before the Reverend Cotton. Now, Jack Ketch was going to hang them, but there was a mysterious character with a mask and a knife who was to behead them. So after each man was hanged and they were all dead, one by one their heads were removed. And this executioner held them up to the crowd and would say, "This is the head of William Davidson, sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered for high treason against the crown." The men were never quartered or cut up afterwards because Sidmouth was worried about the size of the crowd and ordered that men should just be hung and beheaded. And then, and you can see this moment, the execution here, this is a very interesting picture. It's sketched by a man called Géricault, who was a great French artist of the French Revolution. He famously painted a picture called The Raft of the Medusa about the sinking of a French battleship where the surviving crew members had been cast to drive on rafts and had been involved in cannibalism. It's quite a horrific story. And this very dramatic picture was about to go up, had been taken from France. The war with France was now over and was going to be displayed in Piccadilly. So Géricault was in London, staying in a rented house just off of Edgware Road, very close to Cato Street, and heard about the execution of the Cato Street conspirators. So he was one of the 120,000 people in that crowd. And he sketched what he saw. And he sketched Thistlewood. Look at that haunting image of Thistlewood's eyes in his last moments. He stares straight at us. And one horrific moment comes to us. Thackeray, famous writer, tells us that when each of the men were executed, the executioner held up their hands and said, "This is the traitor." The last man to be beheaded was John Thomas Brunt. By now, the executioner's hand was bloody. So as he held up the hand, he actually dropped it, and the head of John Thomas Brunt bounced along the scaffold. Apparently, one of the crowd shouted up, "Butterfingers." So there were nervous laughs across the crowd. It was a sad way for these men that had given their life for what they thought was freedom and democracy, a very sad way for them to die. Prince Levin, the wife of the Russian ambassador, wrote, "Why did Brunt die crying, 'Long live liberty'?" These weren't criminals. These were men that had given their life for the greater, what they believed was the greater good. The families of them, and you could see they all had children. There were 17 children that were losing their fathers, wanted the bodies to be returned to them so they could have a proper burial. But the government refused it. They didn't want any shrines to these men. So the bodies were taken away and put in quicklime, buried within Newgate Prison in unmarked graves, so that hopefully their story after this moment would just disappear. Now, 5 of the men pleaded not guilty: Harrison, Shaw Strange, Wilson, Bradburn, and Cooper. These men were transported to Australia. Now, if I just flick back to this image of the execution, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner Kate Morton's picture, the man with the brown coat with the little boy. We came across an article that mentions that John Cam Hobhouse came to the execution to see his friends executed. He's the man many people believe they would have made the Prime Minister following the revolution, but he was to watch the execution of his friends. And after the execution, he went to the pub that they'd often frequented in Covent Garden and spoke to the landlady there, Nell Bristow, the White Lion. Now, she was sad, but she was sad because these were desperate times for her as a pub owner, and she was now losing 10 of her regular clients. But she wasn't sorry for those executed. She was sorry for those that were going to be transported to Australia. The idea of that long trip to the other side of the world, she thought, was a fate that was worse than death. And here's the entry. The men were transported on a ship called the Guildford. And they set off in May, and they didn't arrive to their final destination in Van Diemen's Land till October. And when they left, and many of them left children behind, and they left wives behind, they left their families around forever. Now, eventually, because these were all decent men, they rebuilt their lives. When they were freed, they tried to get their families to go out, but some of their families didn't want to risk the journey. So many of the men remarried. Quite strangely, some of them, if you look at John Shaw Strange, as part of the bicentenary commemoration, I met one of the descendants of John Shaw Strange, and she said that he actually became a police constable in Bathurst. Strange irony in the story, a twist in the story. So what happened in the aftermath? Now, Byron famously wrote in Marino Filera that those who die in a noble cause, their spirit walks on, they live forever. Did the Cato Street conspirators live on forever? Well, we know Guy Fawkes' story has lived on forever. Everybody knows his name, but nobody knows Thistlewood, Ings, Tidd, Adams, Davidson. Their story is buried in the quicklime in Newgate Prison. And you can see a brief flaming of their fame. People paid a shilling to see the Cato Street barn in the weeks after the trial and the execution. A funny story about someone who just stood outside the door with his hat and charged people a shilling to get in. He had nothing to do with it. Made himself a fortune from the rich and the great and good of Marylebone who wanted to see the notorious place. But very quickly, the place faded from living memory. You can see this picture from 1976. It's very run down. It could quite easily have been demolished and disappeared forever. And the government was so determined to bury the story of the Cato Street conspiracy that they changed the name of the street. You can see it became Horace Street. Didn't revert to Cato Street until 1937. And what became of that cabinet? Well, the most hated of them all, Castlereagh, was involved in a terrible scandal. As a politician, he was hated by the people. But as a politician, he would often march from Parliament back to his home across St James's Park, and he would often frequent prostitutes. And one day he was set up by a group of blackmailers. He was taken back to a house, and the prostitute that he was with turned out to be a man in drag. And the men threatened to spread the story amongst the great and the good. And he was so troubled by the story coming out and destroying his reputation that in 1822, he took his own life at his house in Footscray. It's quite near to where I live. It's quite near to Sidcup. And the men that portrayed the conspirators, George Edwards, Monument, Hayden, these were other things that provided the evidence to get the men found guilty. They were so unpopular that they had to change the name. They had to find new identities. One of them, Hayden, who'd been set up in a new identity and found a job with the government, lived in Fulham, would later be involved in a famous murder and would take his own life. So two of those guilty men would see their comeuppance. So it seems a very negative thing. But when I look at this story, I look at the idea that these men were trying to build a better England, to build a new Jerusalem. And this is what Blake was writing about at the time. It's the time that Blake was publishing Jerusalem, the poem, the idea of building a Jerusalem, a heaven on earth in England's green and present land, a better society for people here to live. And that's what those men, I believe, were trying to do. And eventually, a blue pack appeared on the house. And the further irony, that rundown shack you can see from the 1970s, fortunately, we still have the building there because it was turned into a flat, which is now worth £1.4 million. One of the interesting things is because it was a private house, no one was able to go in and have a look at it. But because it went up for sale on Rightmove, we can see the interior here. And you can see the place where those conspirators had met. And you go to the upstairs room where Smithers was killed by Thistlewood. You can see the wine rack. And you can see in the roof where some of the conspirators escaped. You can see they've got their nice roof terrace. A place worth 1.4 million. But a place where a very historic moment happened in the history of Westminster. And a moment that shouldn't be forgotten. It should be remembered. And I hope that our project contributes to that. Our project will finally end in October. We plan a big exhibition about William Davidson, and we plan to put on a show and performance in Kensington Town Hall in the auditorium as a fitting tribute to men that took part in the Cato Street Conspiracy. And that brings my talk to an end.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. Such an amazingly dramatic story and been in obscurity for far too long. And yeah, hopefully we'll see some of you in the audience in that big exhibition.
Can I just check, because I'm going to use this version of Zoom before, shall I just stop share on this now?
Yeah, if you stop share, and then we should see you full screen.
That's it, and then I'll come back onto them.
Fantastic. Okay, wonderful. So we've got quite a few questions waiting in the Q&A, so we'll move over to that in just a moment. Just to remind you that the Q&A is open, so this is your opportunity to ask Peter questions. Right, okay, we'll crack on with it now. We've got a question from Anthony Weaver. How had Davidson's mother found £11,200? It sounds an amazing sum of money for an ordinary person. Was his mother a landowner, Peter?
It's his father. So he was a planter. Although it's quite finding the evidence here. I've taken that sum. There was many kind of biographies written around the time of the trial because there was huge public interest. So that comes from, it's called an authentic story of the Cato Street Conspiracy. It mentioned that his mother sent this sum of money. I've got no other kind of form of evidence there, but I'm taking that it probably happened that if his father was wealthy enough to send him over to study the law, and it was the mother that never wanted him to leave Jamaica, that always kept an eye out for him and wanted to make sure that that he was okay. And when he heard that he dropped out the law and what happened to him with going to sea and being press gang, she wanted him to have a profession and a livelihood. So gave him enough money to set up a business. So, but that absolutely a huge sum of money at the time. But William liked a good time. He liked to enjoy himself. And you can see from those prints, he liked fine clothes. He He liked to go out dancing, enjoying himself. So maybe he frittered some of that money away, just enjoying himself, just having a good time.
Yeah, it must have been quite a sum in those days, I can imagine. We've got a comment from Chris Rogers who says that the most recent cabinet PM assassination was in 1991, and it was the IRA mortar attack on Number 10. So thank you very much, Chris Rogers.
Oh yeah, that's do you know, I'd forgotten about that, so we'll have to, if I do that again, I'll have to mention it. Thank you very much for correcting me.
Great. And Alison Moore wants to know, did the unemployed go to the workhouse? You did mention that there was a huge scale poverty and unemployment at that time. What were the options?
The workhouse system really began to build up after what happened. You have after sort of the 1832 Great Reform Act gave the vote to the middle classes who wanted to kind of push the rates down. And one way they would do that was to restrict the money that went to provide provision for poor living at home, was to set up more workhouses around the country. So that really escalated through from the 1830s to the end of the 19th century, the use of the workhouse. The real problem was the way landowners manipulated through the corn laws the price of wheat, the basics, because most people, the basic diet of most people in the country was bread, and the prices were kept extortionately high. Shouldn't have been the case. We should have been able to have cheap imports of wheat from Russia that should have pushed down the price of wheat after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but the landowners weren't having it because they rigged Parliament. They made sure all the laws were in their favour. This is what angered people. There was nothing they could do about it unless they could get representation of the people in Parliament. So you look at all of those protests at places like Peterloo, it was all about democracy, about ordinary people having a say and not a few individuals manipulating the state for their own interests.
The story of the land grab is really quite shocking that people could just...
Yeah, the enclosure is just a complete outrage. Those enclosures involved kind of acts of parliament that had to be pushed through. That's why I love that song by the Ascot Sisters. The idea that ordinary men and women would be sent to prison for stealing, but this was a grand act of theft by the aristocracy of this country that just took the common land away from people that didn't belong to them. They just built a fence around and said, that's mine now and you can't have it. And really, in rural areas, it flung people into desperations of poverty, and it pushed them into the cities. It pushed them into the factories, into places like Manchester. It was all part of that terrible upheaval in that period, from the time of the Industrial Revolution, of ways of life completely changing. People having no choice but to move to cities. All happened because of really the greed of a few individuals and stealing and enclosing the land at the time.
Right, we've got a question from Brenda and David Cox. How many people were involved in the conspiracy, and were their plans realistic?
The reports talk about 29 conspirators. They're believed to be more than that. I mean, people even talk about that John Cam Hobhouse, the MP for Westminster, had been involved. On the actual night, I believe some of them, many were on their way there when the Bow Street Runners and the Coldstream Guards burst in. So they didn't go to the barn and they didn't come. But it was no more probably than about 50 men. So it was very unrealistic. And it was just, I think they'd got to a point. You could see that the images I showed you of the snow and the cold on the ground there, that they'd actually reached a point where so many of them were so desperate. William Davidson, for example, hadn't worked for months as a cabinet maker, had no money whatsoever, had actually pawned all of his cabinet making tools just to get a few pennies in. They'd actually got to a point where they thought, well, we haven't got enough men to do this, but we're just going to do it anyway. So there is a good argument that what they were planning to do was unrealistic. They were following, I mentioned kind of the Sparfield riots, that all of the plots at the time almost had the same idea of stealing cannons, going to the Tower of London, taking the Bank of England. Whether 50 men would be able to do that. But Thistle would believe that if he could create a spark, it would set off the country. Once the news that London had risen up And within London, not very far from the Cato Street Conspiracy, you can go places like St Giles, now we're New Oxford Street. There was a huge community there, huge Irish community of people that were dispossessed and desperate, that the Irish were angry enough there that they would join in, and that very soon things would snowball. That's what he was hoping would happen. But whether it would have done, particularly if you see on a winter's night when it's a bit cold, whether that would have dampened the revolutionary ardour of those taking part.
We've got a comment from Terry Gibbs. He says, Lord Eldon was Lord Chancellor and not Chamberlain. So thank you for letting us know that, Terry.
Well, thank you.
And we've got from Neil Carey a question. Were the Prince Regent's lifestyle excesses condemned by the Parliament and aristocracy and newspapers as well?
Yeah, I mean, you can see from the numerous cartoons from the period that he was a figure of fun and was caricatured and ridiculed and was kind of a focal point for anger. And I think probably the government at the time was quite happy that probably he took some of the flack away from them, from what they were, some of the policies that they were implementing at the time, the Lord Liverpool's government.
All right, we have an intriguing comment by Anthony Weaver. Is there a paradox in the lovers of freedom insisting that the king after the glorious revolution of 1866 must be Protestant? And he says, not much religious freedom here, I think. Even Voltaire, witnessing the hundreds killed in the Gordon riots of 1780, commented, and this is the country of freedom. Do you have any comment on that, Peter?
So the idea of it, what's interesting, that most of the Cato Street conspirators were atheists. William Davidson had kind of renounced his religion, but in the last few moments come back to it. So it was certainly you look at that it's unfair that the way they're looking at that thing and the way things were rigged for Protestants against Catholics, and how the government reacted. I mean, you look at some of the administrations before Lord Liverpool's, Spencer Perceval, for example, virulently anti-Catholic. So religion was still kind of playing a part there, and Catholicism seen as the religion of the outsider. A lot of suspicion about that. But the conspirators themselves wanted to see an end to religion. They were kind of really strong advocates of Thomas Paine, common sense. They didn't want royalty, and they didn't really want the idea of religion playing a strong part in kind of in the state.
We actually have another question related to that from Neil Carey. Did Cato Street accelerate or delay the political reforms that followed Catholic emancipation in 1829, Reform Act 1832? I'm
not sure whether they had much influence on that, but I think that it did. You could see there's a succession of events, from the Despard plot, the Sparfields riot, a number of things where the government was involved with kind of putting up agents provocateurs. That they realised maybe with the Cato Street conspiracy, particularly at the time of their trial, that they were pushing their luck a little bit, that maybe that they needed to be a little bit more careful, that these kind of events that they were manipulating as public show trials and executions could actually turn out to be the things that would instigate revolution if they didn't watch what they were doing.
And we've got a question by Rosemary Barnes, who it's a point actually that you picked up on. Why is this conspiracy so little talked about in comparison with the gunpowder plot?
Because I think that the gunpowder plot was used as really by the government for generations afterwards to suppress Catholicism, and I think mainly really is that the government after the Cato Street conspiracy realised that they wanted that they'd wanted to have this big show trial, they wanted this public execution, but the crowds on the days of the execution worried them that maybe their things would get out of control, really, so that it wasn't that they wanted to then quickly end the story. So you can see with the change of the name, with Cato Street becoming Horace Street, with the idea that the conspirators will be buried in unmarked graves within Newgate and their bodies being put in quicklime. They didn't want any martyrs. They didn't want anyone to celebrate this story. They wanted to make their mark, but then quickly they wanted to bury this story and move on. And that it's kind of, and you have to say they were quite effective, really, because if you talk to most people, no one's ever heard of the Cato Street Conspiracy. No one's heard of these figures. It's only people keenly interested in history know about them. But really, they were involved in kind of following exactly what Guy Fawkes did, and Guy Fawkes is known throughout the land, isn't he?
Yes. We've got another question by Neil Carey. Was the reaction of the government to revolutionary agitation influenced by the bloodletting scene in the French Revolution and, in speech marks, the terror?
Yeah, you could basically frighten the people into doing what you wanted to do. They wanted to have that. So you had a succession from Pentrick, and the number of people being, it's medieval, being hung, drawn, and quartered. It's so brutal. That idea that you do this thing and then you'd keep people down, knowing that if they question you, this could be your fate. So getting it out there that this was the ultimate that could happen to you. But then they started rowing back a little bit. If you look at the Cato Street conspirators, they were only hung and beheaded. They weren't drawn by a hurdle to the place of execution, and they weren't quartered afterwards, because the government realised that following through the whole of this brutal medieval term of execution would have inflamed that huge crowd that had. Many people think it's one of the biggest ever crowds that had ever gathered for a public execution, and it would just completely inflame the situation. So I do think that when they've got to that point, they realised that they had to be a lot more careful about what they were doing. But to begin with, we're looking back in that period, I think that they did see how the terror had been used to manipulate and control the population in France following the revolution.
Right, we got a question by Stuart Marshall. Were they hanged with a drop 9 to break their necks, or strangled?
They were, with the common news. The mystery is how they were beheaded. So what they believed is that because this wasn't something that happened regularly, that they actually got a skilled surgeon involved. When we were researching this, looking for sort of evidence of what happened, there's a brilliant article that's actually was in the Lancet, and they apparently that the man who had removed the heads of the conspirators was a surgeon, and that afterwards rumours spread. His name was put around. Now, cut off the top of my head now, I can't remember the name of the individual, but huge crowds gathered at his house, and he was assaulted afterwards. So that was the kind of that was the really controversial bit on the execution. The precise manner of what kind of noose is, I couldn't really say. I don't know.
Okay. We've had a succession of people saying what a wonderful talk it is, and thank you. And I'll spare your blushes. I won't read those out, but thank you very much for putting that in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on a bank holiday weekend. I wasn't expecting to. It was nice to have any kind of audience tonight.
Absolutely. Right, on to the next question. We've got another one by Neil Carey, who obviously knows a lot about Castlereagh. He says, Castlereagh was a complex character who held together the coalition which defeated Napoleon, worked himself to insanity with multiple jobs in government, and led the campaign for Catholic emancipation. But he was seen as the leading voice for suppression at home. So, yeah, it's another paradox picked on.
Yeah, quite a controversial. I mean, you read conflicting things. I mean, he had he was an MP. He had an Irish seat that I think his dad had just bought for him. So in a way, that's a symbol of the corruption and the corruption of the kind of the system there. But it was a politician that was dedicated to kind of public service. The actual kind of things that instigated his suicide, this public scandal that he'd become involved in, apparently that he confided in the Duke of Wellington. Wellington had been involved in some kind of affairs and things before, and said that you should just ignore it, just let them publish and be damned. But he apparently had a good marriage, and he was kind of worried about the impact that the stories circulating amongst society would have on his wife, and it troubled him so much. But also the pressure from at that time, it was a time of revolution, and they were constantly thinking that their government would be overthrown, and he knew he was hated. So to live with that at all times. Apparently he would, I read somewhere, I think when he went to some of the society, he always carried pistols with him. He always felt threatened. So I'm sure that kind of built him into a kind of into a paranoia where he was pushed to the point of suicide.
Sounds an interesting character. That does actually bring us to the end of our advertised time of 8 o'clock. This has been a longer talk than usual because it's such a huge subject to cover. Peter, we do still have some more questions in the Q&A, so would you be happy for us to overrun by about 10 minutes?
Okay, yeah.
For anyone who does need to leave us at 8 o'clock, which is quite understandable, you probably want to go and have your dinner. Just to let you know, first of all, thank you very much for coming. Also to let you know that this talk is being recorded, so if you want to catch up and listen to the rest of the Q&A, that's absolutely fine. We'll be sending out a link to the recording, which will probably reach you by tomorrow morning, and it will also have a feedback form, and it would really help us if you fill out that feedback form. It helps us to develop our events. It's also really nice for our speakers because poor Peter sitting there is doing this presentation to his computer screen. He can't see you all out there reacting, so it's nice to be able to feed your comments back. So yes, for everyone who has to leave us now, thank you very much and goodbye. And for everyone who can stay on, we will press on with the Q&A. So we've got a comment from Bella. She says, thank you, Peter. I'm here via a friend who told me about this talk with 10 minutes to go. Okay, so you might want to watch the recording afterwards then, Bella. She says, I've really enjoyed learning about this and I will find out more. I was interested that some of the men were atheists. Was being an atheist unusual at that time?
Not really. I think it's Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine being involved in the kind of an inspiration for the French Revolution, American Wars of Independence, the ideas of liberty, the idea of common sense. Well, you know, what's the point of royalty? What are these things up there? But also the idea of how kind of religion has always manipulated to keep people in their place. That many people who were strong followers of him, and his books were banned, like, you know, the Common Sense, the Rights of Man. If you sold them, you could be accused of sedition and imprisoned. But people still read them. The reading societies, like the Marylebone, the Thomas Hazard's Marylebone Reading Room, they would have public. They would read what Thomas Paine was writing about, and they were Spenceans. Thomas Spence was probably even more radical than Thomas Paine, and both these men believed that religion was part of the problem. So atheism amongst those radicals was actually quite common. And it was only, I think I said, it was only William Davidson was the only one that at the last moments before his execution turned to religion. The others refused to say prayers at the point of execution.
Right. Serena says, thank you for the fantastic research. The illustrations were great in interpreting the story. Do you know anything about William's descendants?
No, its thing is we've done a huge number of, and it's actually just putting that story out there because even though there's a small amount out on the internet, now we've got the website, the Cato Street Conspiracy website out there. I'm just hoping that it puts the story out there and more people will be interested in there, and perhaps we could. Because there's John and Duncan, and you know, it would be wonderful to find out whether there are descendants there. It's not something that we've done, but I would love to know it. We've got this event in October, and the idea that some descendants of the conspirators could be there. It was a brilliant one we did back in February the 23rd, Sunday, February the 23rd, 2020. the Harrowby Residents Association put this wonderful festival. We brought along an actor to tell the story. We had lots of people, like street performances, lots of local people turned up to commemorate things. And one of the people that turned up was the great-great-great-granddaughter of John Shaw Strange, the conspirator that had pleaded guilty and been transported, and when he had been freed, had become a police constable. And we interviewed her, and the sound recording you can actually find on our website. We managed to record that. So there's lots of we created like a little storybook about William Davidson, which you can view that online. You can see the wonderful illustrations by Kate Morton, some of which were on my presentation. We split Davidson's story into 6 short films that we filmed with him telling his story from the Newgate prison cell. They're online now, and we're still working on some things to finish our project. So in the summer, and I can put this out there now, we're planning a film school at Westminster Archives. So I'm trying to get 12 young people involved in creating a documentary film about the Cato Street conspiracies. I've recruited 7 at the moment. I'm about to go into schools, and I'm going to hope to try and talk and persuade some people maybe to come along. But we've set up a whole week-long film school where we're planning to go to the National Archives, talk to experts about Magna Carta. We're going to go to the British Library. We're going to go to the Museum of London and do an interview in the Newgate prison cell. We're going to the Tower of London to talk about their incarceration there. So we hope to try and make, there's nothing out there on the internet as a kind of definitive film that people can watch to tell this story. We hope to create that and put it on the website, and then bring the whole project to an end on the 1st of October to mark the beginnings of Black History Month, put out our exhibition of William Davidson, but also involve a local school in putting on a performance to tell the story of the conspirators to bring everything to an end. It's a project that meant to last for 1 year, but because of COVID, it's spread over 2 years. But in fact, it's been a blessing because it's allowed us to put a lot more time into the website and to develop things. We've had a lot more time to do things than we normally have on a project like this.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. We've still got questions coming in thick and fast. I'm afraid I won't have time to ask all of them, so I do apologise if I skip your question, but I'll try and pick out a few of them. So Felix Pring says, do you see any parallels between recent proposed damage to statute laws and the behaviour of Lord Liverpool's cabinet?
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, sure. Do you see any parallels between recent proposed damage to statute laws and the behaviour of Lord Liverpool's cabinet? So I suppose basically looking at any civil liberties that might be being affected at the moment.
I think it's far more speak. If you look at the 6 Acts, basically they were creating a police state in England. They were throwing out Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights. Everything was everything that you were supposed to be proud of to be an Englishman, that the foundations of we haven't got a constitution, but the foundations of our state, for expediency, to keep themselves in power and to keep control of revolutionary times, they were destroying what were the basic freedoms of England. So I think it was far more extreme there. I don't think we could compare what we live through today to what people were living in that particular time. And the added, what was going on with it, we're not that far away from the French Revolution, but you're in the height of the Industrial Revolution, and how that had just kind of torn people's lives apart. So it was a very restless kind of period. And even though we're going through difficult times now, I don't think we can compare our lives to the people in them. That's one of the most difficult periods in the history of this country at that particular time.
Related to that, we've got a question from an anonymous attendee. Given the widespread poverty, were the government charges of treason successful with the masses?
So, can you, repeat that again?
Yeah, sure. Given the widespread poverty, were the government charges of treason successful with the masses? And it did sound from what you say as if they got a lot of public support, and possibly it rather backfired on...
I don't think it was really. It was one of those things where you have trade cycles. So you go through recession to boom, and there was a combination of events. I mentioned one thing. It was an interesting thing. You see that the conspiracy was taking place on a snowy night in February. The weather was appalling. The eruption of Tambora, I think it was in 1815, destroyed the harvest for a number of years, and many people think that was a push towards the revolution, because it destroyed the harvest, drove the price of wheat up, caused huge problems across Europe. Gradually, as the impact of that and harvest improved, the problems and the dislocations caused by the Napoleonic Wars filtered out, and prosperity built back. It was that, and also why didn't it's one of the big questions of history? Why didn't we have a revolution in Britain? That was a point where we came very, very, very close to it. In 1848, you'd have the big Chartist protest from democracy there. So in that kind of 20-year period, we could well have had a revolution, and then gradually, just I think the improvement in a lot of a lot of people there, and improvement in conditions, and a slight loosening in democracy. The middle class is having some say, and I think that's had a big impact on not moving us towards revolution. I think that is definitely a factor of what happened there at the time.
Brilliant. Well, we've gone more than 10 minutes over now, so I think we are going to have to bring it to an end. I'm sorry if I didn't get a chance to ask a question. There's just one more question I'm going to go to, a very short one by Gary Daniel. Peter, are you writing a book on this? The presentation was amazing.
We've actually got, if you go onto the website, a lot of things that I was talking about, we created, it's called William Davidson and the West End Job. And it's got Kate's wonderful images on. There's like a flick book, so you can actually go in there and go through the pages and look through that. And we had enough money to print about 100 copies, which we gave out to some of the schools that we worked with. But we haven't. It was the thing is, when you do a lottery project, it's the main thing is to produce things that are free to the public, and that's kind of what we've done. That we've not produced it to sell, but I think it's a really fascinating. It's a fascinating story, which is really. I'm hoping that the small thing we do by creating a kind of website, which can be a kind of a focal point, that allow more people to look at it. I know in the secondary school curriculum now, it's something that's got onto the curriculum that people look in. So I hope they can use our resources and make something of them. There's literally, I've done my PowerPoint. I spent today cutting probably 50 slides out of I have this massive PowerPoint presentation. I have student interns volunteering to help us on the website, and it's got like 150 slides. Because I just add a new slide with some information, and then kind of like I put it out to a student. Can you research that further and look into different things? There's so many different angles you could come at this story. It really is a fascinating story to look at.
Wonderful. Well, that really does bring us to an end. Thank you so much for everyone that's left wonderful comments in the Q&A. I promise that even though I didn't read them out, I will definitely show them to Peter afterwards. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for Peter. That was a fantastic talk. And,
thanks everyone. Once again, thanks for supporting Westminster Archives on a bank holiday weekend to get history lovers out on a Friday when you can be down the pub. We're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And when you get your email tomorrow with the feedback form, it will have a link to Eventbrite. We've got lots of other events coming up from our colleagues across Westminster Libraries. So do have a look at that, and we hope you'll join us for some more. Just quickly before we go, I did mention our summer film school. It's going to be right at the end of July, going to the beginning of August. We're kind of looking to try and recruit people that would be kind of between the ages of about 12 to sort of 18, that kind of age group. I'm going to try and put it out to it, but if you know of teenage young people interested in history, would like to take part in that, just get in touch with Westminster Archives and we can give you details about that. Okay, wonderful. That is all, folks. Have a good evening and goodbye. Thank you.